On a quiet spring afternoon in Villa das Araucarias, the sun filtered through the windows of old houses, creating a dance of light and shadows along the narrow streets. Henrique, an 8-year-old boy, sat on the worn-out living room rug, completely absorbed in his planet puzzle, a birthday gift he cherished. Outside, the distant hum of passing cars and the murmur of neighbors chatting by their gates added a sense of ordinary, peaceful routine. He lived with his mother, Raquel, a nurse who worked long shifts at the central hospital, and his stepfather, Marcelo, who had only recently become part of the family. Although Henrique was trying to adjust to Marcelo's presence, he still didn't feel entirely comfortable around him. But that day, something shattered the usual rhythm of their home. His half-sister, Marina, 13 years old, walked in from school with a downcast expression, her face pale, her eyes swollen. Henrique immediately sensed that something was wrong. Marina had always been his favorite playmate, the first to ask about whatever new thing he was interested in. Yet, that afternoon, she didn't even greet him or glance at his puzzle. Instead, she headed straight to her room and shut the door without a word. A sense of unease crept over the boy. For weeks, he had noticed Marina withdrawing, becoming quieter, more distant. But this time, her silence felt heavier, as if something much worse was happening beneath the surface. Unsure of what to do, Henrique crept toward Marina's door and pressed his ear against it. He heard faint sobbing. His teacher's words from citizenship class echoed in his mind. If something feels off, trust your instincts and seek help. He wanted to knock, to go inside and ask her what was wrong, but something held him back. What if she didn't want to talk? What if she got angry at him for meddling? He stood there, hesitating, his heart pounding. Suddenly, a sharp voice made him jump. From the kitchen, Marcelo was calling him impatiently. "Henrique, get over here right now. We need to talk," he shouted, the sound of dishes clattering against the sink filling the house. Something about his tone sent a chill down Henrique's spine. It wasn't mealtime, and there was no reason for such urgency. As he approached the kitchen, he saw Marcelo rummaging through drawers and staring out the window with a tense, almost restless expression, as if looking for something or someone. Henrique's stomach twisted. The atmosphere in the house suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. Raquel arrived home from work just as the tension in the house thickened. She stepped through the front door, exhausted from her shift at the hospital, only to find Henrique standing stiffly beside Marcelo in the kitchen. Her first instinct was to check on her daughter, but before she could ask, Marcelo spoke first. "Marina needs discipline," he muttered, his tone dry and absolute. Something in the way he said it made Raquel pause. She glanced at Henrique, noticing the unease in his posture, the way he gripped the edge of the counter with small, tense hands. But fatigue got the better of her. She had worked for hours, barely eaten, and her mind was already clouded with the tasks awaiting her the next day. So, she exhaled deeply and chose not to press the matter, at least not tonight. Henrique, however, couldn't shake the uneasiness tightening around his chest. Marcelo's words echoed in his head. Marina needs discipline. What did that mean? What had she done that was so wrong? As night fell and the house grew quiet, he remained alert, unable to sleep. Then, in the darkness of the hallway, he heard muffled footsteps. He carefully pushed back his blanket, his heartbeat drumming in his ears, and tiptoed toward the door. Peeking out, he saw Marcelo standing in front of Marina's room, knocking with an insistence that made the boy's skin crawl. "You've been acting out, young lady," Marcelo said in a low, firm voice. "You need to remember who's in charge here." Marina's door creaked open slowly, revealing her pale face, her lips pressed tightly together. Henrique, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, held his breath. He couldn't hear everything being said, only fragments. Marcelo's firm, cutting tone and Marina's soft, barely audible responses. Then suddenly, the door slammed shut. Henrique flinched. Marcelo walked out of the room a few minutes later, locking eyes with the boy as he passed. "Why are you up? Go to bed and stop snooping where you don't belong," Marcelo snapped, his voice laced with something Enrique couldn't quite name. Anger, maybe, or warning. Frozen in place, Enrique felt his legs trembling beneath him. He nodded quickly and retreated into his room, but sleep never came. Lying in bed, Enrique clutched the old phone his mother had left for emergencies. His fingers hovered over the screen, his mind racing. He knew something was wrong. Marina had been growing more withdrawn, more afraid, and now, tonight, she looked completely defeated. His teacher's voice rang in his ears again. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Get help. But calling for help meant going against Marcelo. It meant possibly making things worse for Marina. As he stared at the phone, uncertainty gnawed at him. Would anyone believe an 8-year-old? And if they did, what would happen next? By morning, Raquel had already left for another long shift at the hospital. The house felt different in her absence, quieter yet heavier, as if the air itself carried a weight that pressed down on everyone inside. Marcelo sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, his eyes fixed on Marina as she packed her school bag with trembling hands. Enrique, sitting across from them, barely touched his breakfast, too focused on the silent tension in the room. Then, without warning, Marcelo leaned toward Marina and whispered something in her ear. Whatever he said made her face drain of color instantly. Enrique's stomach clenched. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it was bad. A few moments later, Marcelo made his decision clear. "You're not going to school today," he told Marina, his tone leaving no room for argument. The girl froze, staring down at the floor, her hands tightening around the straps of her backpack. She didn't protest. She didn't even look up. Enrique, on the other hand, felt a rush of panic. Why wasn't she fighting back? Why was she just accepting it? He wanted to say something, to tell Marina to run, to tell her to call their mother. But he was only 8, and Marcelo was an adult. Would anyone listen to him? He swallowed hard, grabbed his own school bag, and left the house alone, his mind racing the entire way. At school, Enrique couldn't focus. The words of his teacher blurred on the board. His classmates' voices faded into background noise. All he could think about was Marina, sitting alone in that house with Marcelo. He remembered his citizenship teacher's lessons. If you ever suspect someone is in danger, speak up. If you don't feel safe at home, find someone you trust. But who could he trust? His mother was gone for hours at a time. His teachers wouldn't believe him without proof. And if he called the police and he was wrong, what would happen to their family? During recess, while his friends played soccer, Enrique sat alone beneath a tree, scribbling in his notebook. He made a list, options, ideas, anything that might help. Tell his mother? Too risky. She was barely home. Talk to the school principal? Maybe. But what if they called Marcelo, the police? That option scared him the most. What if they showed up and Marcelo found out Enrique was the one who called? What if he got angry? What if things got worse for Marina? The more he thought about it, the more trapped he felt. But one thing was clear. Doing nothing was not an option. After school, Enrique walked home with a knot in his stomach. His hands clenched the straps of his backpack, his mind replaying every moment of the morning. Marina's pale face, Marcelo's cold stare, the way the air in the house had felt suffocating. He wanted to believe that nothing had happened while he was gone, but a voice in his head told him otherwise. As he approached the front gate, he heard something that made his breath hitch, muffled voices, tense and sharp, coming from inside. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly pushed the door open. The sounds were coming from Marina's room. Enrique stepped in quietly, his heart pounding as he listened. He couldn't make out full sentences, but he heard enough. Marcelo's low, clipped tone, Marina's trembling voice trying to reason with him, and then something that made Enrique freeze. A choked sob. His sister was crying, and not in the quiet way she had before. This was different. This was fear. His grip tightened around the doorframe as he felt his pulse in his ears. He needed to do something. Then a sudden loud thud echoed through the house, followed by Marcelo's voice, louder now, more aggressive. "Stop with the attitude! I'm tired of your behavior!" Enrique flinched. His breath came out in short, panicked bursts as his brain screamed at him to move, to act, to help. His legs carried him before his mind could catch up, dashing toward his bedroom. He grabbed the emergency phone his mother had left behind, his small fingers shaking as he pressed the numbers he had memorized but never thought he would have to use. 190. A moment later, a calm yet firm voice answered. "Emergency services, what's your location?" Enrique swallowed the lump in his throat and whispered into the receiver, "My stepfather is hurting my sister. Please come quick. My name is Enrique. I'm 8 years old, and we live at Rua das Araucarias, number 45. The dispatcher's voice was reassuring, but Enrique could barely hear it over the rush of blood in his ears. He had done it. He had called for help. But now, all he could do was wait and pray that he had made the right choice. After hanging up, Enrique hid in the hallway closet, pressing his back against the wooden panels. His heart pounded so loudly he feared it would give him away. Every second felt like an eternity as he strained to hear what was happening outside. Marcelo's footsteps stomped across the floor, the sound growing closer, then fading again as he moved toward Marina's room. Enrique squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the phone tightly in his small hands, hoping, praying that help would arrive before it was too late. Minutes that felt like hours passed before Enrique heard the faint but unmistakable sound of a car stopping outside. Peeking through a crack in the closet door, he saw the shadowy outlines of two uniformed figures approaching the house. They moved quietly, with no sirens, no flashing lights, just a sharp knock at the door. "Good afternoon. We received a call from this address," one of the officers announced. Enrique held his breath. For a moment everything was silent, then the sound of footsteps, Marcelo's, moving toward the entrance. The door creaked open and Marcelo's voice came, forced and tight. "There must be some mistake. Everything's fine here." Enrique knew that voice, the same one he used when he wanted to sound in control, when he wanted people to believe his version of reality. But the officers weren't convinced so easily. "Sir, we still need to check," one of them insisted, their tone calm but firm. Enrique edged forward in his hiding spot, his fingers digging into the wooden panels as he waited for what would happen next. Then from down the hall, a sudden noise, Marina's muffled sob. It was faint, but it was enough. One of the officers immediately turned toward the sound. "Who else is in the house?" he asked. Marcelo hesitated, but the delay spoke volumes. Enrique could hear the shift in the officer's tone, the rising suspicion. Then the second officer stepped forward, pushing past Marcelo, heading toward the hallway. Enrique felt his entire body tense as he realized this was it. Marcelo's control over them was about to shatter. The moment the officer stepped down the hallway, Enrique's breath caught in his throat. Marcelo turned abruptly, blocking the officer's path, his posture tense, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I told you, everything is fine here," he insisted, his voice sharper now, edged with something Enrique had heard before, anger barely restrained. But the officer didn't back down. "Sir, step aside," he ordered, his voice calm but firm, unwavering. Enrique could see Marcelo's jaw tighten, his fingers twitching as if calculating his next move. Then a sound broke the standoff. Marina's voice, small and trembling, came from behind the half-closed door. "Please, don't let him send you away," she whispered. That was all it took. The officer pushed forward, shoving past Marcelo and reaching for the door handle. Enrique held his breath, watching as the officer slowly opened the door to reveal Marina curled up in the corner of the room. Her face was pale, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to disappear. Enrique had never seen her look so small, so fragile. One of the officers knelt beside Marina, his tone gentle but serious. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Marcelo, who stood frozen in the hallway, his fists clenched, his entire body radiating fury. She gave the smallest nod, her lips pressing together as fresh tears welled in her eyes. Enrique felt his stomach twist. He had known something was wrong, but seeing Marina like this, made his chest ache in a way he didn't understand. The moment stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the second officer reached for his radio. "We need medical assistance at Rua das Araucarias, number 45. Possible case of domestic abuse. Suspect present." Marcelo took a step forward at those words, his eyes dark with rage. Enrique shrank further into his hiding place, his hands shaking as he watched the scene unfold. He had called for help, but now, staring at Marcelo's expression, he wondered, had he just made things worse? Marcelo's face darkened as he took another step forward, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Enrique could see the anger simmering beneath his expression, the kind of rage that made the air feel heavy, suffocating. "You're making a mistake," Marcelo hissed, his voice a mix of forced calm and barely contained fury. The officer standing between him and Marina squared his shoulders, his hand resting near his holster, a clear warning. "Step back, sir," he commanded, his voice edged with authority. For a moment, Enrique thought Marcelo might lunge, that he would lash out in one last desperate attempt to take control. His body was rigid, his fists clenching and unclenching as if fighting against the impulse. Then, as the second officer moved closer, the sound of distant sirens filled the air, growing louder with every second. Marcelo's eyes flicked toward the window, his jaw tightening. He knew what was coming. Enrique felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that, for the first time, Marcelo wasn't the one in control anymore. As the sirens approached, Marina's breathing grew more erratic. She flinched at every movement, her hands gripping the fabric of her sweater as if trying to anchor herself. One of the officers knelt beside her, his voice softer now. "You're safe," he assured her. "We're here to help." But Marina didn't look convinced. Years of fear, of walking on eggshells, weren't erased in a single moment. Enrique's heart ached for her, for all the times he had seen the sadness in her eyes and hadn't known what to do. Then, the front door burst open. Two more officers entered, their presence filling the space, making it clear that this was over. Marcelo turned sharply, his body stiff, his eyes darting between them like a cornered animal. One officer approached him cautiously. "Turn around and put your hands behind your head," he ordered. For the first time, Marcelo hesitated, but as one officer reached for his cuffs, Marcelo let out a bitter laugh, raising his hands just slightly. "You have no idea what you're doing," he muttered. Enrique held his breath, watching as the man who had once dominated their home now stood on the verge of losing everything. The moment the handcuffs clicked around Marcelo's wrists, Enrique felt his whole body go weak. He had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, but none of them prepared him for how real it felt. Marcelo didn't resist, but his entire posture radiated restrained fury. As one of the officers guided him toward the door, he cast a single glance back, his eyes locking onto Enrique's hiding spot. It was a look filled with something dark, something Enrique didn't have a name for, but he knew it meant danger. Marina, still curled against the wall, flinched at the sound of the door slamming shut behind Marcelo. The house felt different, lighter in some way, but the fear still lingered in the corners, clinging to the walls like a shadow that refused to leave. One of the officers crouched next to her again, speaking gently. "We need to get you checked out by a doctor, just to make sure you're okay." Marina nodded hesitantly, her hands still gripping the fabric of her sleeves. Enrique could see the redness around her wrists now, the faint bruises along her arms. He swallowed hard, guilt creeping into his chest. Why hadn't he acted sooner? One of the paramedics entered, a woman with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. She knelt next to Marina, speaking in a calm, even tone. "Can I take a look at your arms?" Marina hesitated before slowly extending them, flinching slightly at the touch. Enrique felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. He hated seeing his sister like this, so fragile, so small. The paramedic gently examined her, then turned to the officers. "She needs medical attention," she confirmed. "Nothing life-threatening, but we should take her in for further evaluation." As they helped Marina to her feet, Enrique finally stepped out from his hiding place. His legs felt shaky, his heart still racing, but he moved toward her without hesitation. Marina turned to him, her face unreadable, but when he reached out, she grabbed his hand and held on tightly. It was the first time in weeks that she let him close, that she didn't pull away. Enrique squeezed her fingers, trying to tell her without words that she wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. As Marina was led toward the ambulance, Enrique followed closely, refusing to let go of her hand. The front yard, once just a place where they played or waited for their mother to come home, was now filled with police cars and flashing lights. Neighbors had gathered near their fences, whispering among themselves, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Enrique felt their eyes on him, but he didn't care. None of them had seen what he had. None of them had heard Marina cry in the dark. His only focus was on his sister, making sure she wasn't alone. Before they could step into the ambulance, a car pulled up fast, tires screeching against the pavement. Raquel. She practically jumped out before the engine had fully stopped, her hospital scrubs still on, her face pale and frantic. Her eyes darted around, scanning the chaos until they landed on Marina. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, pushing past the officers. "Baby, what happened? Oh my God, are you okay?" Her voice cracked, and for the first time, Enrique saw his mother scared, not just tired, not just stressed, but truly terrified. Marina hesitated, her lips trembling as she tried to find the words. But then Raquel saw the bruises. Her breath hitched, her hands hovering in the air as if afraid to touch her daughter, afraid to confirm what was already obvious. Then her eyes moved to Enrique, silently pleading for an explanation. He swallowed hard. "I called them," he said in a small voice. "I heard him. I knew something was wrong." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else that had happened that night. Then, without warning, Raquel pulled both of them into her arms, holding them so tightly it almost hurt. She buried her face into Marina's hair, her body shaking as she whispered over and over, "I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have known." Enrique felt his own throat tighten, his mother's embrace grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just surviving the storm. They were standing together, holding on to each other through it. The paramedics gently guided Marina into the ambulance while Raquel hesitated, torn between wanting to stay with both of her children and needing to be by her daughter's side. Enrique saw the battle in her eyes, the way she kept glancing between him and Marina, her hands twitching as if she wanted to grab them both and never let go. One of the officers, the one who had first stepped into their house, approached and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Your daughter needs medical attention and will need to take her statement later. You should go with her," he said, his voice steady. Raquel nodded, though tears still pooled in her eyes. She turned to Enrique, kneeling so they were at the same level. "I'll be back as soon as I can," she promised, cupping his face in her hands. "You're so brave, Enrique. You saved your sister." He wanted to believe her, wanted to feel like a hero, but all he could think about was the weight in his chest, the lingering fear that maybe this wasn't over. What if Marcelo came back? What if the police let him go? What if everything went back to the way it was? As the ambulance doors closed, Marina's eyes found his through the small window. There was something different in her gaze, not just fear, but relief, a silent thank you. Enrique swallowed hard and gave her a small nod, even though he wasn't sure she could see it. Then the sirens blared to life, and the ambulance pulled away, taking Marina and Raquel with it. Enrique stood frozen in place, watching the red lights fade down the street, until all that was left was the cool night air and the sound of his own breathing. One of the officers knelt beside him, his expression kind but serious. "We're going to take you somewhere safe for tonight," he said. "Someplace where your mom can find you later." Enrique nodded slowly, the exhaustion of the past hours finally weighing him down. He wanted to sleep, wanted to wake up and find that this had all been a bad dream. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something new, and no matter what came next, they would never be the same again. Enrique sat in the back of the police car, his small hands gripping the edge of the seat. The city lights flickered outside the window, blurring together as the car moved through the quiet streets. He had never been in a police car before. It felt strange, the weight of everything pressing down on him, making his chest feel tight. The officer driving occasionally glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his face unreadable but not unkind. "You're safe now," the officer said, after a long stretch of silence. But Enrique wasn't sure if he believed that yet. They arrived at a temporary shelter, a small, warm-looking building with a soft yellow glow coming from the windows. A woman in a navy blue sweater greeted them at the entrance, her smile kind but cautious, like she didn't want to scare him. "Hi, Enrique," she said gently. "My name is Clara. You'll stay here for a little while until your mom can come get you." Enrique hesitated before stepping out of the car, his legs heavy, his mind still stuck in the events of the night. Was Marina okay? Had they really taken Marcelo away for good? A part of him still expected to hear the front door slam open, to hear that voice calling his name with barely restrained anger. Inside, the shelter was cozy, but it didn't feel like home. The walls were painted in soft colors. There were shelves filled with books and a few scattered toys, but everything felt unfamiliar. Clara led him to a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the dark street. "You can sleep here tonight," she said softly, placing a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. Enrique nodded, but didn't move. He wasn't sure if he could sleep, not with so many thoughts racing in his head. Clara seemed to notice his hesitation and knelt beside him. "Would you like to talk about anything?" she asked. Enrique looked at her for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the hem of his shirt. Finally, he whispered, "Is my sister okay?" Clara gave him a reassuring smile. "Your mom called while you were on your way here. Marina is being taken care of, and she's going to be okay. Your mom will come see you first thing in the morning." Enrique exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, a small weight lifting from his chest. Maybe things weren't okay yet, but at least Marina was safe. That was what mattered most. Enrique lay on the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant murmurs of the shelter. Occasionally, footsteps echoed down the hall, doors opening and closing, the quiet hum of voices blending into the night, but none of it felt real. His mind was still trapped in the house on Rua das Araucarias, replaying everything over and over. The moment Marina had walked in looking defeated, the way Marcelo had spoken to her, the way his hands had clenched into fists. Enrique squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memories away, but they clung to him, refusing to let go. He turned onto his side, gripping the pillow tightly. His teacher always said that bravery wasn't about not being scared, it was about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. Hadn't he done that? Hadn't he done the right thing? Then why did he still feel so small, like nothing had really changed? What if Marcelo got out? What if he came looking for them? Enrique's stomach twisted at the thought, a cold wave of fear washing over him. He had called for help, but what if it wasn't enough? The door creaked open, and Clara peeked inside, holding a cup of warm milk. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. Enrique shook his head, shifting to sit up. She walked over, handing him the cup, sitting on the chair beside his bed. "That's normal," she said after a moment, watching him with gentle eyes. "You've been through a lot. It's okay to feel scared." Enrique didn't say anything at first, just wrapped his hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into his fingers. Finally, he muttered, "What if he comes back?" Clara didn't rush to answer. She let the words settle between them, giving him space to breathe. "The police know what happened," she finally said. "They're making sure you and Marina are safe, and your mom." She's going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Enrique looked down at the milk, tracing a finger along the rim of the cup. He wanted to believe that. He really did. But the fear still lingered, whispering in the back of his mind. Still, he nodded, just enough to make Clara smile a little. "Try to rest," she said softly, standing up. "Tomorrow will be better." Morning arrived slowly, the soft light creeping through the curtains as Enrique blinked awake. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. He turned over, expecting to see the familiar walls of his bedroom, the scattered pieces of his planet puzzle on the floor. But then reality came crashing back. The police, the ambulance, Marina's pale face. The weight in his chest returned, heavy and unshakable. Nothing was normal anymore. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, as a quiet knock sounded at the door. Clara peeked in, smiling gently. "Good morning, Enrique. Your mom is on her way." At those words, relief washed over him. But it was mixed with something else. Uncertainty. What would happen now? Would they go back home? Would Marina want to talk about any of it? He nodded slowly, his fingers twisting the fabric of his shirt, trying to untangle the thoughts racing through his mind. A while later, he heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Then, before he could even react, the door swung open, and Raquel rushed in, dropping to her knees in front of him. "Oh, baby," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. Enrique felt her arms tremble, the warmth of her body overwhelming him. For the first time since the night before, he let himself relax, pressing his face into her shoulder, letting the emotions finally catch up to him. She smelled like the hospital, faintly of antiseptic and lavender lotion, but beneath that was something else, something familiar. Home. When she pulled back, her eyes were red, tired, but filled with love. She cupped his face in her hands, brushing a thumb over his cheek. "How are you feeling?" Enrique opened his mouth to answer, but he wasn't sure what to say. Was he scared? Relieved? Still trapped in the fear of yesterday? Instead, he just shrugged, and Raquel nodded as if she understood anyway. "We're going to figure this out," she promised. Together. Enrique wanted to believe her, and maybe for the first time he really did. Raquel kept Enrique close as they left the shelter, her arm wrapped around his shoulders like a protective shield. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, the air thick with the scent of wet pavement from an early morning drizzle. Enrique wasn't sure where they were going. Home didn't feel like an option anymore, not after everything that had happened. The idea of stepping back into that house made his stomach twist. He looked up at his mother, hoping she had an answer to the question he was too afraid to ask. They got into a taxi, the silence stretching between them like an invisible wall. Raquel kept glancing at him as if she wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. Finally, as the car pulled away, she took a deep breath. "We're not going back to the house," she said, her voice firm. "At least, not until I know it's safe." Enrique exhaled slowly, a quiet relief settling in his chest. But then another thought crept in. If they weren't going home, then where would they go? As if reading his mind, Raquel continued, "We're going to see Marina first. She's still at the hospital, but she's okay." Enrique nodded, gripping the seatbelt tightly. He needed to see her, to make sure with his own eyes that she was safe. He hadn't realized how much he needed that reassurance until now. Even though Marcela was gone, there was still a part of him that couldn't shake the fear that something else might go wrong. The city blurred past the taxi window, but Enrique barely noticed. His thoughts kept drifting back to Marina, to the way she had looked the night before, so small, so broken. Would she be different now? Would she want to talk to him? He didn't know what he would say to her, but he knew one thing for sure. He needed to be there. No matter what came next, they had to face it together. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and something faintly metallic, a scent Enrique couldn't quite place, but didn't like. The waiting room was filled with quiet murmurs, the occasional beep of a monitor from a nearby hallway. He held tightly onto his mother's hand as they walked past nurses and doctors in crisp white coats. His legs felt heavy, his heart pounding harder with every step. He had thought he was ready to see Marina, but now that they were here, a nervous knot twisted in his stomach. Raquel stopped outside a pale blue door and turned to him. "She's been asking for you," she said softly. Enrique swallowed hard, unsure of what to expect. Would she be mad at him? Would she be the same Marina he had always known, or had the past few weeks changed her forever? He took a deep breath as Raquel pushed the door open, stepping inside with quiet hesitation. And then he saw her. Marina was sitting up in bed, a hospital blanket pulled around her shoulders. She looked tired, her face still pale, but there was something else there too, something softer, lighter. When she saw him, a small, almost shy smile crossed her lips. "Hey, astronaut," she whispered. Enrique's chest tightened at the nickname, a lump forming in his throat. She had always called him that because of his love for space, for planets and the stars. He hadn't realized how much he had missed hearing it. Without thinking, he rushed forward, wrapping his arms around her. Marina let out a small laugh, though he could feel her shoulders trembling. She held on to him tightly, as if grounding herself, as if making sure this moment was real. Enrique squeezed his eyes shut, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the warmth of her arms around him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself believe they were safe now. They had made it. For a long moment, neither of them let go. Enrique clung to Marina like she might disappear if he loosened his grip, and Marina held onto him as if she was afraid of being left alone. Raquel watched them in silence, her eyes glistening, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to reach out but wasn't sure how. This wasn't just a hug. It was an unspoken promise, a desperate reassurance that they still had each other. Enrique felt a lump rising in his throat, but he refused to cry. Marina needed him to be strong. Finally, she pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were tired, but there was warmth in them, something fragile but real. "You called them, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Enrique hesitated, then nodded, expecting, what? Anger? Resentment? Instead, Marina exhaled shakily, giving him a small, knowing smile. "I think you saved me," she murmured, squeezing his hand. Enrique's chest tightened at her words. He had spent all night wondering if he had done the right thing, but hearing it from her made all the doubt fade away. Raquel finally stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Marina's back. "Baby, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Marina stiffened for just a second before letting out a shaky breath. "I didn't want to ruin everything," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "I thought, maybe if I just stayed quiet, it would get better." Raquel's face crumpled, guilt flashing across her features. "No, sweetheart, you should never have had to go through that alone." Enrique watched as his mother leaned in, wrapping Marina in an embrace. He saw the way Marina hesitated, then melted into it, her fingers clutching the fabric of their mother's shirt. It was the first time in weeks that he saw his sister look like herself again, not the girl weighed down by secrets and fear, but the Marina he remembered. He didn't know if everything would be okay from now on, but in that moment it felt like they were finally moving towards something better. Marina shifted slightly in bed, her fingers still curled around Raquel's sleeve, as if she wasn't quite ready to let go. Enrique watched her carefully, noticing how small she looked in the hospital gown, how different she seemed from the sister who used to tease him about his space books. He wanted to tell her that things would go back to normal, that everything would be fine now, but he wasn't sure if that was true. Some things, once broken, didn't just fall back into place. Raquel pulled away slightly, brushing Marina's hair back from her face. "The doctors said you're going to be okay," she murmured, her voice gentle but firm. "You just need rest and time." Marina nodded absently, but there was a faraway look in her eyes, like she was still trying to process everything. Enrique recognized that feeling. He had spent all night trapped in it, trying to untangle the fear and confusion inside him. "How did you move forward when everything you had known had suddenly shifted?" After a moment, Raquel took a deep breath, and sat down on the chair beside the bed. "The police are keeping Marcelo in custody," she said, her voice tight, controlled. "They're building a case against him." Marina flinched at the mention of his name, her hands pulling at the hospital blanket. Enrique felt his own stomach twist. He hadn't wanted to ask, but the thought had been haunting him since the night before. Was he really gone? Would he stay gone? Seeing the tension in both of them, Raquel reached out, taking Marina's hand in one of hers and Enrique's in the other. "He's not coming back," she promised. "I swear to you both, I won't let that happen." Marina let out a shaky breath, and for the first time, Enrique saw something shift in her posture, a tiny sliver of relief. Maybe they weren't completely safe yet, but at least, for the first time in a long time, they weren't trapped in silence anymore. The hospital room fell into silence after Raquel's words. Enrique kept his eyes on Marina, searching for any sign that she truly believed their mother's promise. He knew she wanted to. He wanted to. But the fear still lingered in the corners of the room, heavy and unspoken. It was hard to forget the weight of Marcelo's presence, the way his voice had filled the house like a storm cloud that never cleared. Even now, Enrique half expected to hear the front door slam open, his sharp voice cutting through the quiet. Marina finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he finds a way back?" Raquel squeezed her hand, her grip firm, steady. "That won't happen," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "The police are taking this seriously. There will be charges. He won't just walk away." Marina swallowed, nodding slightly, but Enrique could see the hesitation in her eyes. He understood. Marcelo had controlled their lives for so long. It was hard to believe that, just like that, it was over. Raquel sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. For the first time, Enrique noticed just how exhausted she looked. The dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. She had worked long shifts at the hospital for years, but this was different. This wasn't just tiredness. This was guilt. She blamed herself. Enrique wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known, but the words felt too big for him. He didn't know how to make her believe it. Instead, Marina did. She reached out, touching Raquel's arm lightly. "Mum," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You didn't know." Raquel let out a shaky breath, blinking quickly, as if trying to hold back tears. "I should have," she murmured. "I should have seen it." Marina shook her head. "He made sure you didn't." Enrique watched as something between them shifted. Not everything was fixed, but maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand each other again. Raquel exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against her temples as if trying to push away the weight of everything that had happened. For years, she had juggled long shifts, exhaustion, and the constant pressure of providing for her children. She had thought she was doing everything right, working hard to build a stable home, trusting Marcelo to be the support she so desperately needed. But now, sitting in this hospital room, looking at Marina's bruised wrists and Enrique's worried eyes, she saw the truth. She had missed the signs, let things slip through the cracks. And the worst part, she didn't know if her children would ever fully forgive her for that. Marina, as if sensing her thoughts, shifted slightly, adjusting the hospital blanket around her shoulders. "I was scared to tell you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first I thought maybe I was just imagining it, that I was overreacting, but then it got worse." Her fingers twisted the fabric between her hands, her face pale. "And I didn't want to make things harder for you." Raquel's breath hitched. She had spent so much time trying to protect her children from the world. She had never realized they had been trying to protect her, too. Enrique, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "I heard you crying," he murmured, looking at Marina. "That night, I knew something was wrong." Marina looked at him sharply, her eyes filling with something unreadable. "I thought you didn't notice," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Enrique swallowed hard. "I noticed," he whispered. "I just didn't know what to do." The words felt small, but they held so much weight. He had wanted to help her for so long but hadn't known how. Until now. Raquel reached for both of them, wrapping an arm around each. "We're going to be okay," she promised, her voice stronger this time. "We're going to heal together." It wasn't just something she said to comfort them, she meant it. There were still wounds that needed time to close, scars that might never fully fade. But for the first time, they weren't facing this alone. The weight of Raquel's words settled over them, filling the room with a fragile kind of hope. Enrique leaned into her touch, feeling warmth for the first time in what felt like forever. Marina, though still tense, let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just a little. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still questions left unspoken, fears that lingered in the background, but at least for now, they were together. Raquel pulled them closer, pressing a kiss to Marina's forehead, then to Enrique's. "I love you both," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. Enrique felt his throat tighten, but he managed to whisper back, "I love you too, Mom." A soft knock at the door made them all look up. A nurse peeked in, offering a gentle smile before stepping inside. "Sorry to interrupt," she said kindly, "but I need to check Marina's vitals real quick." Raquel gave a small nod, reluctantly letting go of her daughter, though her fingers lingered on Marina's hand for just a second longer. Enrique shifted back, but stayed close, watching as the nurse moved around the room, adjusting monitors and writing notes on a clipboard. He didn't understand everything she was doing, but he could tell Marina was uncomfortable, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. Raquel noticed too, reaching out to squeeze her daughter's fingers. "It's okay, sweetheart," she reassured her. "We're not going anywhere." Marina nodded, but her expression was still distant, lost in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. Enrique wondered if she was thinking about Marcelo, about all the nights she had spent trapped in fear, about how none of this would just disappear overnight. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to go through it alone, that he would always be there, just like she had always been there for him. Instead, he just reached for her other hand and gave it a small squeeze. The nurse finished her checkup, smiling softly. "Everything looks good," she said, looking at Marina. "The doctor will be by later to discuss your release." Raquel exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said sincerely, before turning back to her children. Enrique knew that walking out of the hospital wouldn't magically fix everything, but maybe, just maybe, it was the first step towards something better. And for now, that was enough. Later that afternoon, as the hospital room grew quieter, Enrique sat by Marina's bedside, watching the rain drizzle against the window. The soft patter of water against the glass made everything feel still, as if the world itself had paused. He traced invisible patterns on the blanket draped over his lap, his mind drifting between memories of the past and fears of the future. Even though Marcelo was gone, the feeling of unease hadn't completely left him. Every time a nurse walked by the door or a shadow moved in the hallway, his heart jumped just a little. Would this fear ever go away? Raquel was sitting in the chair beside Marina, absently rubbing her temples, exhaustion lining her face. She had barely left the room all day, afraid to be too far from them, as if she might lose them again if she blinked. Enrique wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words felt too big for his small voice. Instead, he reached out, tugging gently at her sleeve. She looked up immediately, her tired eyes softening as she smiled at him. "What is it, baby?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried the warmth he had missed so much. Enrique hesitated before asking, "What happens now?" Raquel let out a slow breath, exchanging a quick glance with Marina, who was now looking at her hands. "Well," she started carefully, "we're not going back to that house, at least not for a while." Enrique felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty settle in his chest. He didn't want to return to those walls, to the memories still trapped in the corners of that house, but the idea of leaving everything behind felt just as scary. Marina didn't say anything, but the way her shoulders tensed told him she felt the same. Raquel reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from Marina's face. "We're going to take this one step at a time," she assured them. The police are handling everything. And I promise you, we're never going to let someone like him into our lives again." Marina nodded slightly, but Enrique could still see the uncertainty in her eyes. Promises were comforting, but they didn't erase the past. Still, it was the first time in a long time that their mother was speaking with certainty, making decisions that put them first. And for now, that was enough to hold on to. Marina shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if trying to shield herself from the weight of the conversation. Enrique watched her carefully, noticing the way her fingers curled into the fabric, her grip tightening every time their mother mentioned the future. He wondered if she was afraid of leaving the hospital, of stepping back into a world that hadn't protected her before. He wanted to tell her that things would be different now, that she didn't have to be scared anymore. But the truth was, he didn't know if that was true. All he knew was that he wouldn't let her go through it alone. Raquel sighed, rubbing a hand over her face, her exhaustion showing in every movement. "The social worker will meet with us tomorrow," she explained, her voice quieter now. "They want to make sure we have everything we need before we leave." Enrique frowned, not quite understanding what that meant. "Are we going to live somewhere else?" he asked hesitantly, his fingers twisting in his lap. Raquel hesitated before nodding. "For now, yes," she admitted. "Just until we figure things out." Marina finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Raquel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "A safe place," she promised. "Somewhere we can breathe again." Enrique didn't know what that meant, but he knew his mother wasn't telling them everything. She had always been strong, always held everything together. But now, even she seemed uncertain, as if she was trying to convince herself that everything would be okay. Enrique wasn't sure if it was. The room fell into silence again, only the soft beeping of the heart monitor filling the empty space between them. Enrique hated that sound. It reminded him too much of where they were, of why they were here. He wanted to be home, but not in the way it had been before. He wanted a home that didn't feel like walking on eggshells, where he didn't have to listen for slammed doors or whispered threats. He wanted to know what it was like to sleep without fear. But was that even possible anymore? That night, Enrique curled up in the hospital chair next to Marina's bed, his head resting against the padded armrest. The lights were dimmed, and the hallway outside was quiet except for the occasional footsteps of nurses making their rounds. His mother had gone to speak with the social worker again, leaving him and Marina alone in the sterile room. He could hear her breathing, slow and measured, but he wasn't sure if she was asleep or just pretending. He wanted to say something, to let her know he was still there, but the words felt too heavy in his mouth. Instead, he just stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of machines. After a long silence, Marina finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" Enrique hesitated, unsure how to answer. Normal. What did that even mean anymore? Before Marcelo, normal had been playing in the backyard, building pillow forts and arguing over who got to pick the TV channel. Now, normal felt like something out of reach, like a memory of a life they could never go back to. He sighed, shifting slightly in his chair before whispering, "I don't know." Marina turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I hate that he made me feel like this," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. "Like I was nothing." Enrique sat up straighter, his chest tightening at her words. "You're not nothing," he said quickly, his voice more forceful than he intended. Marina blinked at him, surprised by his sudden intensity. "You're my sister," he continued, his throat tightening. "And I don't care what he said or did. You're not nothing." For a moment, Marina didn't say anything. Then slowly she nodded, as if absorbing his words, letting them settle. "Thanks, astronaut," she murmured, the nickname slipping from her lips like a quiet reassurance. Enrique smiled faintly, the smallest flicker of warmth breaking through the cold weight in his chest. It wasn't much, And it wouldn't fix everything, but it was something. And right now, something was enough. The following morning, the hospital room was filled with the soft golden light of sunrise. Enrique blinked awake, his neck sore from sleeping in the chair, his body stiff from the awkward position. For a second, he forgot where he was, but then the beeping of machines and the crisp hospital sheets brought reality back. He turned his head and saw Marina still curled up in bed, her breathing even, her face calmer than it had been the night before. It was the first time in weeks that she looked at peace, even if just a little. Enrique sat up slowly, stretching his arms, careful not to wake her. The door opened quietly and Raquel stepped inside, carrying a tray with a small breakfast. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but there was something else in her expression, something steadier, more certain. "Good morning," she said softly, placing the tray on the small table near Marina's bed. Enrique rubbed his eyes, still shaking off sleep, as his mother sat beside him. "The social worker called," she continued. "They found a place for us to stay." Her voice was careful, as if she wasn't sure how they would react. Enrique glanced at Marina, who stirred slightly but didn't wake up. He lowered his voice when he spoke. "Is it far?" Raquel sighed, brushing a stray curl from her face. "Not too far. It's temporary, but it's safe," she reassured him. "We'll have time to figure out what comes next." Enrique nodded, but uncertainty still gnawed at him. A new place meant new routines, new rooms, and the absence of the only home he had ever known, even if that home had been filled with fear. Would it ever feel like home again? Marina shifted under the blanket, letting out a small sigh as she slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze flickered between Raquel and Enrique, her brows furrowing slightly. "What's going on?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. Raquel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're leaving today," she said. "We're going somewhere safe." Marina blinked, absorbing the words, and for a second she didn't say anything. Then, with a slow nod, she whispered, "Good." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of quiet preparations. Raquel handled the paperwork, speaking in hushed tones with the doctors and social workers, while Marina slowly got dressed, moving carefully as if every movement still carried weight. Enrique sat on the chair near the window, watching the world outside, feeling the strange sensation that everything was moving forward too quickly while he was still trying to catch up. He had thought leaving the hospital would make him feel relieved, like they were finally closing this chapter. But instead, it just made everything feel more real. They were leaving, but what exactly were they walking into? When it was finally time to go, a nurse arrived with a wheelchair for Marina. She wrinkled her nose at it, but didn't argue, too tired to protest. Enrique walked beside her as they moved through the long hospital corridors, past rooms filled with people whose lives were different, but maybe just as complicated. He wondered if anyone else in this building had ever felt like this, like a part of their life had been ripped away, and they weren't sure how to rebuild it. Raquel walked slightly ahead, checking her phone as they neared the exit, her posture tense, as if bracing for something. Enrique didn't ask what she was thinking. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. When they stepped outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet pavement and fresh-cut grass. The city felt too big all of a sudden, too full of possibilities and unknowns. A black car was waiting near the curb, its engine quietly running. Raquel thanked the social worker standing beside it before turning to Marina and Enrique. "This is where we start over," she said, forcing a small smile, but there was something fragile about it. Enrique wasn't sure if she was trying to convince them or herself. Marina met his gaze for a long moment before looking away, adjusting the sleeve of her sweater. "I just don't want to be scared anymore," she admitted quietly. Enrique felt his stomach twist because he wanted to tell her that she wouldn't have to be, that everything was finally safe. But safety wasn't something you just declared. It was something you had to rebuild, piece by piece. Without saying anything, he reached for her hand and squeezed it. She squeezed back. That was enough for now. They stepped into the car, and as it pulled away from the hospital, none of them looked back. The drive to their new home was quiet, the hum of the car engine the only sound filling the space. Enrique sat by the window, watching the city pass by, tall buildings giving way to quieter streets lined with trees. The unfamiliar scenery made his chest feel tight. He had memorized every crack in the sidewalk near their old house, every shop on the corner, every neighbor's dog that barked too much. Now, all of that was gone, replaced by something unknown. He knew this was supposed to be a fresh start, but why did it feel so much like running away? He glanced sideways at Marina, who sat next to him, staring down at her lap, lost in thought. Raquel sat in the front, speaking quietly with the driver, occasionally glancing back at them through the rearview mirror. Enrique could tell she was nervous, though she tried to hide it. Maybe she was wondering if this would be enough, if moving away would actually make things better. Or maybe she was thinking about all the things she should have done differently. Enrique wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, but the words felt too heavy to say out loud. So instead, he just watched her hands tighten around the strap of her bag, the only sign that she was holding herself together by sheer will. After nearly an hour, the car slowed down, turning into a quiet neighborhood. The buildings here were smaller, the streets cleaner, and there were trees lining the sidewalks, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze. Enrique wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not. Did it mean they were somewhere safe, or just somewhere temporary? The car pulled up in front of a modest two-story building with a small courtyard surrounded by a metal gate. It looked nothing like their old house, and yet somehow it already felt like a place where the past couldn't reach them. Raquel turned in her seat, forcing a small, tired smile. "We're here," she said, but it didn't sound like excitement. More like relief, like they had outrun something dangerous but weren't sure if it would ever truly be gone. Enrique glanced at Marina again, searching for some sign of how she felt about all of this. But she just nodded, exhaling slowly, as if trying to prepare herself for whatever came next. Maybe that was all any of them could do. Stepping out of the car, Enrique felt a strange sensation settle over him. Not fear, not relief, just something in between, like standing on the edge of something unknown. The air smelled different here, fresher, without the familiar scent of their old street, where the bakery on the corner always left a trace of warm bread in the air. He shifted his backpack on his shoulders, suddenly aware of how light it was. Most of his things had been left behind, packed in boxes that might never be opened again. The thought made his chest feel tight, as if parts of his old life were dissolving with each step he took toward the building. Raquel led the way, opening the gate and stepping onto the small front patio. The building itself looked simple, cream-colored walls, a few plants near the entrance, and windows covered with white curtains that fluttered slightly in the wind. It didn't look like a home, at least not yet. It looked like a place where people went to disappear. Marina followed closely behind their mother, her posture stiff, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. Enrique recognized that feeling, the need to hold on to something, anything, just to feel steady. Inside, the apartment was small but clean, with light-colored walls and a wooden floor that creaked slightly under their steps. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with only a couch and a table, as if the space was waiting to be filled. It wasn't home, but it wasn't a hospital room either, and maybe that was enough for now. Raquel set her bag down on the kitchen counter and turned to face them, her hands resting on her hips like she was about to say something important. But for a long moment, she just looked at them, her eyes flicking between Enrique and Marina, as if checking to make sure they were really here, as if part of her still feared this was all just another nightmare. "We'll make this work," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. She was trying to sound certain, trying to anchor them in something real. Enrique nodded because he wanted to believe her, because he needed to believe her. Marina, on the other hand, didn't say anything. She just walked toward one of the bedrooms and closed the door behind her without a word. Raquel exhaled, pressing her fingers against her forehead, but she didn't go after her. Instead, she turned back to Henrique, offering him a tired but hopeful smile. "Come on, astronaut," she said softly. "Let's figure out where you're going to sleep." Henrique followed his mother down the short hallway, his feet making soft sounds against the wooden floor. There were only 2 bedrooms, and one of them was already claimed by Marina, which meant he and Raquel would have to figure out the sleeping arrangements. When they stopped in front of the smaller room, Raquel pushed the door open, revealing a simple space. Just a bed, a small dresser, and a window that overlooked the street below. It felt empty, stripped of anything familiar, and for a second, Enrique wasn't sure how to feel about it. It wasn't his old room, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and piles of books stacked in the corner. It wasn't home, but maybe someday it could be. Raquel placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You can have this room," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "I'll sleep in the living room for now." Enrique turned to look at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt. He knew she was trying to make things easier for him, trying to give him a space that felt like his own. But part of him wondered if she was doing it because she didn't want to be alone either. He nodded, stepping into the room, running his fingers along the smooth surface of the dresser. It was strange, the idea of starting over, of rebuilding from nothing. Raquel leaned against the doorframe, watching him with a careful expression. "We'll get your things soon," she promised, though Henrique wasn't sure if that was true. "And if you want, we can decorate however you like." Her voice carried an edge of forced optimism, the kind adults used when they were trying to make something sound better than it was. Enrique appreciated the effort, but all he could do was shrug. Right now, decorations didn't matter. What mattered was that they were here, away from Marcelo. Safe, at least for now. But was safety something that could last? Before Raquel could say anything else, a soft sound echoed from the hallway, a door creaking open. Enrique turned just in time to see Marina stepping out of her room, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking around the apartment like she wasn't sure how she had ended up here. Then, after a long moment, she glanced at Enrique and spoke. "It's weird, isn't it?" Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Enrique realize she wasn't just talking about the apartment. He nodded, meeting her gaze, because for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what she meant. Marina shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her arms still crossed tightly against her chest. Enrique could tell she felt as out of place as he did, like they had been dropped into someone else's life and were waiting for it to feel like their own. Raquel, standing between them, seemed to sense the weight of the silence, her lips pressing together as if she was trying to find the right words. But what could she say? There was no instruction manual for this, no perfect sentence that could erase what had happened. Instead, she let out a slow breath and motioned toward the small kitchen. "Why don't we eat something?" she suggested. Neither Marina nor Henrique moved at first. Eating felt like such a normal thing to do, and nothing about their situation felt normal. But Raquel was trying, and Henrique didn't want to make things harder on her. So he nodded, shoving his hands into the pockets of his hoodie and following his mother into the kitchen. Marina hesitated for a moment before trailing behind, her movements stiff, like every step took effort. The kitchen was small, barely enough room for the 3 of them to stand comfortably, but at least it was theirs. It was strange how something as simple as a different kitchen could make their whole life feel unfamiliar. Raquel opened a cabinet, pulling out a few plates and setting them on the counter. "I'll make something quick," she said, more to herself than to them. "We didn't have time to get groceries, but I think there's some bread and cheese in the fridge." Enrique watched as she moved around the space, trying to pretend that everything was fine, that this was just another evening in a home that didn't feel like home yet. He sat down at the small table, resting his chin in his hand, watching Marina as she took the seat across from him. Her fingers drummed softly against the table, a nervous habit she had always had. After a moment, she finally looked up at him. "Do you think they'll let him out?" Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it hit like a stone in Henrique's chest. The question had been lurking in the back of his mind too, but he had been too afraid to ask it. He didn't know the answer. He wanted to believe that Marcelo was gone for good, that the police wouldn't let him come near them again, but fear had a way of making doubts feel like truths. Raquel turned sharply at Marina's words, her eyes filled with something fierce. "They won't," she said firmly. "I won't let them." Raquel's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. A quiet desperation, a plea for them to believe her. Henrique wanted to trust her words, to feel reassured. But the fear inside him wasn't so easily silenced. He had seen too much, heard too much to think that just because someone was taken away, they were gone forever. Marina, sitting across from him, didn't look convinced either. She kept her arms crossed tightly, her fingers digging into her skin, her expression unreadable. But instead of arguing, she just nodded, as if saying it out loud wouldn't make a difference anyway. Raquel turned back to the counter, slicing the bread with slow, deliberate movements. The only sound in the kitchen was the dull scrape of the knife against the cutting board, filling the silence that none of them knew how to break. Enrique's stomach growled faintly, but he barely noticed. Eating felt like something distant, something that belonged to another life, one where they weren't constantly looking over their shoulders. He glanced at Marina again, trying to read her expression, but she was staring at the table, lost in her own thoughts. He wondered if she was thinking the same thing he was, if they would ever stop being afraid. After a moment, Raquel placed 2 sandwiches in front of them, sitting down across from them with her own plate. "We're going to be okay," she said, as if repeating it would make it true. Marina didn't answer, just picked at the crust of her sandwich without taking a bite. Henrique forced himself to take a small bite, even though his appetite was gone. It tasted normal. Bread, cheese, nothing special, but somehow it felt like the most important meal he had ever had. Not because he was hungry, but because it was the first one in a place that was supposed to be safe. As they ate in silence, a noise from outside made Enrique's breath catch, a car door slamming shut. He stiffened immediately, his fingers tightening around his sandwich, his mind jumping to the worst possibility. Marina's head snapped up, her eyes wide, mirroring his fear. Raquel, noticing their reaction, was already standing, moving toward the window. She pulled back the curtain slightly, looking outside. After a long moment, she let out a breath and turned back to them. "It's just the neighbor," she said softly. "Everything's fine." But even as she said it, Henrique could see it in her face. She had been just as scared as they were. That night, Henrique lay awake in his new bed, staring at the ceiling, his body stiff under the unfamiliar weight of the blankets. The room was too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that made every creak in the floor and every distant car passing outside feel louder than it should. He had thought that being away from the house, from Marcelo, would make him feel safer. But fear wasn't something you could leave behind like an old piece of clothing. It clung to him, sitting heavy in his chest, whispering doubts into his mind. What if Marcelo got out? What if he found them? What if none of this was really over? He turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, trying to focus on the sound of his own breathing. In the dark, everything felt bigger, his thoughts, his fears, the weight of everything that had happened. He wondered if Marina was awake too, lying in her own bed just down the hall, trapped in the same cycle of worry. Maybe she was staring at her ceiling, just like he was, waiting for sleep to come but knowing it wouldn't. The idea of her being scared alone made his stomach twist. She had always been the strong one, the person he looked up to, but now she was just as lost as he was. Pushing back the covers, Henrique slipped out of bed, his bare feet making almost no sound against the cool wooden floor. He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the hallway, the dim glow of a street lamp outside casting long shadows on the walls. The apartment felt different at night, almost like it wasn't real, like it was just another temporary place they were passing through. But he didn't want it to be temporary. He wanted this to be the place where they stopped running. Taking a deep breath, he moved toward Marina's door and knocked softly. "Marina," he whispered, "are you awake?" There was a pause, just long enough for him to wonder if he should go back to bed. Then, the door creaked open, and Marina stood there, her eyes tired, her hair slightly messy from sleep. "Yeah," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Enrique hesitated too, unsure of what to say now that she was in front of him. But Marina seemed to understand without him having to explain. She sighed and stepped aside, letting him in. "I can't sleep either," she admitted, sitting on the edge of her bed. Enrique nodded, closing the door behind him, because somehow being in the same room made the fear feel smaller. Enrique sat beside Marina on the bed, pulling his knees up to his chest. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow from the street lamp outside, casting soft shadows on the walls. Neither of them spoke at first, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, the kind of silence that only siblings could share. Marina rested her chin on her hand, her gaze distant, lost somewhere in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. Enrique didn't need to ask what she was thinking about. He already knew. They had escaped, but the fear hadn't left them. It clung to them like a second skin. After a long moment, Marina let out a slow breath. "I keep thinking about how everything felt normal once," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, before he showed up. Enrique swallowed hard, staring down at his feet. He had been so young when Marcelo came into their lives, too young to understand what was happening at first. At the beginning, things had seemed okay. Marcelo had smiled, had tried to act like part of the family, but little by little the smiles faded, replaced by harsh words, then by silence, then by something worse. By the time Enrique realized that something was wrong, Marina was already deep in it. "I thought if I was just quiet, if I didn't make him mad, it would get better," Marina continued, her fingers gripping the fabric of her pajama sleeve. "But it never did." Enrique turned to her, his chest tightening at the way her voice cracked on the last word. He hated Marcelo for what he had done, for making her feel like she had to endure everything alone. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. "You shouldn't have had to deal with it alone," he said, his voice small but firm. "I should have done something sooner." Marina looked at him sharply, shaking her head. "No, Enrique. You did more than anyone. You called for help. You saved me." The words made something shift inside him, a flicker of relief cutting through the guilt. For so long, he had felt powerless, like a child watching something terrible happen without knowing how to stop it. But now, hearing Marina say it out loud, he realized something important. He hadn't been powerless. He had made a choice that changed everything. Enrique looked down at his hands, his fingers gripping the edge of Marina's blanket. Hearing her say those words should have made him feel better, but instead, they made his chest ache. He had done something, yes, but it hadn't felt like enough. He had spent so many nights hearing Marina cry through the walls, seeing the way she flinched when Marcelo walked into the room, knowing something was wrong, but feeling too small to change anything. Even now, with Marcelo gone, the fear hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape. Would they ever truly be free of it? Marina sighed and leaned back against the headboard, her eyes on the ceiling. "I hate that he made us feel this way," she murmured, "like we're always waiting for something bad to happen." Enrique nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Even now, every sound in the apartment made his body tense. Every unexpected movement made his heart race. Fear had become a habit, something that didn't leave just because the danger was gone. But he didn't want to live like that forever. And he knew Marina didn't either. They couldn't let Marcelo take anything more from them. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you think it'll ever go away?" His voice was small, uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Marina was quiet for a long time, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee. Then finally, she shrugged. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe not completely, but I think it'll get easier." Enrique wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that one day they wouldn't have to flinch at every noise, that they could laugh without worrying about who was listening. Marina turned to him, her expression softer now. "We're not in that house anymore, Henrique," she reminded him. "And he's not here." Henrique swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He repeated her words in his mind, trying to make them feel real. They weren't in that house anymore. They weren't trapped. Maybe they weren't okay yet, but they were free. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step towards something better. Marina let out a slow breath, rubbing her hands over her arms as if trying to warm herself. Even though the room wasn't cold, there was something in the air, a heaviness that neither of them could shake. Henrique watched her for a moment, noticing how tired she looked. Not just the kind of tired that came from a lack of sleep, but the exhaustion that settled deep in the bones, the kind that didn't go away overnight. He knew it because he felt it too. It was the weight of everything they had carried, everything they were still trying to leave behind. After a moment, Marina shifted, pulling her blanket up around her shoulders. "You should go back to bed," she said quietly. But there was no real authority in her voice. It was more of a suggestion than a demand, like she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Henrique hesitated, glancing toward the door, but he didn't want to leave just yet. The thought of going back to his own room, lying in the dark alone, made his stomach twist. He wasn't ready to face the quiet again, not yet. So instead, he shook his head. "Can I stay here?" Marina blinked at him, surprised, but then she nodded. "Yeah," she said, shifting to make space for him. "If you want to." Henrique climbed onto the bed beside her, pulling his legs up and resting his back against the headboard. For the first time in a long time, the silence between them didn't feel so heavy. They didn't need to say anything else, just knowing that they weren't alone was enough. Marina let out a small sigh, leaning her head against his shoulder, and Henrique stayed still, letting her rest. It wasn't home yet, but it felt like something close. The weight in Henrique's chest didn't disappear completely, but for the first time in days, it felt a little lighter. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady sound of Marina's breathing beside him, the soft hum of the world outside. Maybe things would never go back to the way they were before. Maybe they would always carry this with them. But they had made it through the worst together, and that had to mean something. As sleep finally crept in, Henrique held on to that thought, because for now, it was enough. The next morning, Henrique woke up to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through Marina's curtains. For a second, he forgot where he was, the warmth of the blankets and the quiet of the apartment making him feel almost normal. But then, the memories of the past few days settled in, heavy but not crushing, just there, like something that wouldn't go away, but might become easier to carry. He stretched slightly, careful not to wake Marina, who was still curled up beside him, her breathing slow and steady. It had been a long time since he had seen her sleep so peacefully. Maybe she wasn't completely okay yet, but this was a start. He slid off the bed quietly, his feet touching the cool wooden floor. As he stepped into the hallway, the scent of coffee filled the air, along with the faint sound of something sizzling in the kitchen. His stomach growled before he could stop it, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he realized he was actually hungry. He followed the smell, rubbing his eyes as he walked into the kitchen where Raquel stood by the stove, flipping eggs in a pan. She looked over her shoulder when she heard him, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Morning, astronaut," she said softly. Henrique hesitated, leaning against the counter. There was something different about this morning. Not lighter, exactly, but steadier. Maybe it was just the way Raquel seemed more present, more grounded than she had in weeks. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, they had woken up in a place where fear didn't hang over them like a storm cloud. He watched as his mother plated the eggs and placed them on the small table, the movements familiar, comforting. He hadn't realized how much he had missed simple things like this. Raquel pulled out a chair and motioned for him to sit. "Marina still asleep?" she asked as she poured coffee into a mug, her voice softer than usual. Enrique nodded, picking at the edge of the table. "She will be for a while," he muttered. Raquel sighed, sitting across from him, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. "That's okay," she said after a moment. "She needs rest." Enrique knew she was right. They all did. But he also knew that rest wasn't just about sleep, it was about feeling safe enough to let go. And for the first time, maybe they were getting closer to that. The quiet hum of the morning settled around them as Enrique slowly ate his breakfast. Each bite felt like a reminder that life was still moving forward, that even after everything, they still had small routines to hold on to. Raquel sat across from him, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze distant but softer than before. It was the first time in days that she wasn't rushing to fix something, wasn't running between phone calls or meetings with social workers. Enrique could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of everything they had gone through. But there was something else too, a quiet determination, a promise to herself that she wouldn't let them go through this alone again. After a while, Marina's bedroom door creaked open. Enrique looked up just as she stepped into the kitchen, her hair messy from sleep, her face still marked by the faint shadows of exhaustion. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering between them, as if she wasn't sure whether she belonged in this moment of quiet normalcy. But then, Raquel stood and pulled out a chair, her movements slow, deliberate. "Come eat," she said softly. There was no pressure, no expectation, just an open seat at the table. Marina nodded and sat down, reaching for a piece of toast, her movements careful, as if testing how it felt to simply exist here, without fear. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy or painful. It was tentative, cautious, but not unwelcome, a silence filled with understanding rather than unspoken pain. Enrique glanced at Marina every now and then, noting the way she chewed slowly, as if she was still getting used to the idea of eating without feeling sick. She caught him looking once and gave him a small, tired smirk. "What?" she asked, her voice raspy from sleep. Enrique shrugged, swallowing a bite of eggs before answering. "Nothing, just making sure you're not a ghost or something." Marina let out a quiet laugh, small but real. Raquel smiled, her shoulders losing some of their tension, as if the sound alone had lifted a weight from her chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. They weren't healed, they weren't whole, but they were here, together. And maybe that was all they needed right now. One morning, one meal, one small step towards something better. The warmth of breakfast lingered in the small kitchen, wrapping them in a fragile sense of normalcy. Marina finished her toast in slow, deliberate bites, as if savoring something she hadn't tasted in a long time. Peace. Enrique poked at the last of his eggs, watching as his mother took slow sips of her coffee, lost in thought. For the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't waiting for something bad to happen. There was no tension in the air, no looming fear creeping through the walls. But even in the calm, Enrique knew that the past still had its grip on them. Raquel finally set her mug down, her fingers tracing circles against the ceramic. "We need to talk about what comes next," she said, her voice careful, measured. Enrique and Marina both looked up, the ease of the morning fading just slightly. Their mother was still tired, still weighed down by everything, but there was something firm in her tone. Something unshakable. She wasn't just trying to keep them safe anymore. She was trying to rebuild something real. Enrique straightened in his chair, glancing at Marina, who simply nodded, as if bracing herself. Raquel folded her hands on the table, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I spoke with the social worker this morning," she continued. "They're helping us find a more permanent place to stay." Enrique felt his stomach tighten at her words. This apartment had always been temporary, a place to catch their breath. But the idea of moving again, of uprooting what little stability they had, made him uneasy. "Where?" he asked, hesitantly. Raquel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Not far," she reassured them. It'll be in the same area, so you won't have to change schools, but it'll be ours." Marina let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. Enrique could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was trying to stay composed, trying not to show how much the idea of moving unsettled her. He understood. Everything in their life had been unpredictable for so long, and now, even when things were supposed to be getting better, the changes kept coming. Raquel must have noticed too, because she reached across the table, placing a hand gently over Marina's. "I promise, this time it will be different," she said softly. "No more running, no more looking over our shoulders. We'll make it a home." Marina stared at their mother's hand resting on hers, her fingers twitching slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to pull away or hold on tighter. Enrique watched her carefully, waiting for her to say something, to react in some way. But instead, she just nodded, a slow, hesitant movement that felt more like an act of acceptance than agreement. Raquel's promise hung in the air between them, solid and unshaken, but words had never been enough to fix what had been broken. It wasn't just about finding a new place to live, it was about finding a way to belong somewhere again. And that was something none of them knew how to do yet. Raquel withdrew her hand gently, letting Marina have her space, and leaned back in her chair. She studied them for a moment, her eyes filled with something unreadable: concern, exhaustion, maybe even guilt. "I know it's a lot," she admitted, her voice softer now, "and I don't expect either of you to feel okay overnight." Enrique shifted in his seat, pressing his hands against his lap. He appreciated that she wasn't pretending everything would magically be fine. They had spent too long pretending. It was time for something real. After a pause, Marina exhaled and finally met their mother's gaze. "When?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Raquel hesitated for only a second before answering. "By the end of the week," she said. "We'll go see the place tomorrow." Enrique felt something twist in his stomach. Everything was moving so fast. They had barely settled here, barely begun to process everything, and now they were already preparing to leave. But wasn't that the point? To move forward? To stop feeling stuck in the past? He wanted to believe it would help. He just wasn't sure if he was ready yet. Marina leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, as if trying to process it all. "Okay," she murmured. "I guess we should at least see it." Raquel gave a small smile. Not happy, not excited, just relieved that they weren't shutting down. Enrique nodded along, trying to match their acceptance, but deep inside, he wondered if moving somewhere new would actually change how they felt. Because no matter where they went, the past was still with them. And no matter how much they tried to run from it, some things didn't just disappear. The rest of the day passed in a strange, muted haze, as if none of them quite knew what to do with themselves. Raquel spent most of the afternoon on the phone, handling paperwork, talking to the social worker, making plans for their move. Marina retreated to her room, closing the door behind her, the quiet hum of music barely audible through the thin walls. Enrique lingered in the living room, flipping through channels on the small television, but nothing held his attention for long. It was as if they were all waiting for something, a shift, a sign that things were really going to change. But nothing came, just time, stretching forward, uncertain and heavy. By evening, the apartment felt smaller, as if the weight of unspoken words had filled every corner. Enrique found himself pacing the hallway, glancing at Marina's closed door, debating whether or not to knock. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, maybe nothing at all. Maybe he just didn't want to be alone with his thoughts anymore. Before he could decide, her door creaked open, and she stepped out, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I can hear you thinking from across the apartment," she muttered, leaning against the wall. Enrique gave her a sheepish shrug. "Sorry." They stood there for a moment, neither of them moving, the dim hallway light casting long shadows on the floor. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly easy either. Finally, Marina let out a breath and tilted her head toward the door leading outside. "Want to get some air?" Enrique nodded immediately, relieved that she had said it first. They slipped on their shoes and stepped out into the cool night, the air crisp against their skin, the sky stretched wide above them. For the first time in days, Enrique felt like he could breathe. They walked in silence for a while, following the quiet rhythm of the empty sidewalks. The streetlights flickered slightly, casting an orange glow over the pavement. Enrique kicked at a stray pebble, watching as it skidded across the ground before finally speaking. "Do you think moving will really help?" Marina didn't answer right away. She stuffed her hands into the pockets of her hoodie, her gaze fixed on the distance. Then finally she sighed. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think staying here would be worse." Enrique nodded, and for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe she was right. The night air wrapped around them as they walked, neither in a hurry to go back inside. There was something calming about the quiet streets, the distant hum of the city blending with the sound of their footsteps. Enrique glanced at Marina from the corner of his eye, watching the way she kept her arms tucked into her hoodie, her shoulders slightly hunched. She looked like she was carrying something heavy, something she hadn't figured out how to put down yet. He knew that feeling well. It sat in his own chest, too, a weight that didn't quite leave, no matter how far they walked. They reached a small park at the end of the street, nothing fancy, just a couple of benches and an old swing set that creaked when the wind blew. Marina stopped, staring at it for a moment before sighing and sitting down on one of the swings. Enrique hesitated before sitting on the one beside her, the rusted chains groaning slightly under his weight. For a moment, they just sat there, letting the world exist around them without saying anything. It was strange how silence could feel different depending on where they were. In the apartment, it had felt heavy, suffocating. Here, under the open sky, it felt almost manageable. Marina finally broke the silence, her voice soft. "Do you think Mom really believes things will get better?" Enrique didn't answer right away, kicking at the dirt beneath his feet. "I think she has to believe it," he said after a moment. "I think that's the only way she knows how to keep going." Marina let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah," she muttered. "She always pretended things weren't as bad as they were. Guess she's just doing the same thing now." Enrique wanted to argue, to tell her that things were different this time, but he wasn't sure if he believed it himself, so instead he just said, "Maybe pretending is the only way we get through it." Marina looked at him then, really looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then after a long pause, she nodded. "Maybe," she murmured, gripping the swing's chains a little tighter. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the trees, making the swings sway just a little. Enrique watched them move, feeling like they were caught in something bigger than themselves, a space between the past and the future, waiting to see which way the wind would push them next. The air between them grew heavier, filled with words neither of them knew how to say. Marina shifted slightly on the swing, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the rusted chain, lost in thought. Enrique wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but part of him already knew. They were both wondering the same thing. If moving away, if starting over, would be enough to erase everything they had been through, but deep down, he knew the answer. No new house, no fresh start, could make them forget. The past didn't work like that. Marina let out a slow breath, tilting her head back to look at the sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind the glow of the city lights, but they were still there. "Do you ever wish we could just disappear?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Enrique frowned, surprised by the question. "Like, run away?" he asked, kicking at the dirt beneath his feet. Marina nodded slightly, still looking up. "Not forever. Just long enough to stop feeling like this." Enrique didn't respond right away, because the truth was, he understood exactly what she meant. Long enough to feel like themselves again. Long enough to forget. After a moment, he sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I don't think running would help," he admitted. "We'd still feel the same, just in a different place." Marina turned her head slightly, looking at him out of the corner of her eye. "Yeah," she murmured. "I guess you're right." The words felt empty, like they were saying them just to convince themselves. But what else could they do? They couldn't change the past, and they couldn't outrun it either. All they could do was keep moving forward, even if they weren't sure where they were going. The street was quiet, except for the distant hum of passing cars, the occasional bark of a dog somewhere far away. For a long time, they just sat there, listening to the sounds of the night, neither of them in a rush to go back inside. Enrique glanced at Marina again, wondering if she felt as trapped as he did, stuck between wanting to forget and knowing that forgetting was impossible. Maybe things wouldn't ever go back to normal, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a new kind of normal, one that didn't hurt so much. Marina kicked at the ground, making the swing sway slightly, though she didn't push off completely. It was like she wanted to move but couldn't quite let go of the weight in her chest. Enrique watched her, trying to read her expression, but she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, lost in whatever thoughts were swirling in her mind. He wished he could say something that would make it all better, something that would erase the fear and uncertainty still hanging between them. But there was nothing, no magic words, no perfect solution, just time. And time didn't always heal things the way people said it did. "I hate that he still feels like he's here," Marina said suddenly, her voice sharp but quiet. Enrique felt his stomach twist because he knew exactly what she meant. Marcelo was gone, but the feeling of him, the fear he had planted in their home, still lingered in the walls of their minds, refusing to leave. Enrique swallowed hard, gripping the cold metal chain of his swing. "Do you think it ever stops?" he asked. Marina finally looked up, her expression unreadable, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her hoodie. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I want it to." Enrique nodded, understanding in a way that didn't need words. They had spent so much time waiting for someone else to fix things, waiting for their mom to notice, for the police to come, for everything to just go away. But it wasn't that simple. Nobody could take away what had already happened. Nobody could erase the memories, the nights filled with silence that wasn't really silent, the days spent pretending everything was fine. The only thing they could do now was try to take back the pieces of themselves that Marcelo had stolen. The problem was, neither of them knew where to start. Marina exhaled, running a hand through her tangled hair. "I keep thinking about that night," she muttered, her voice quieter now. Enrique didn't ask which night. He already knew. The night he made the call, the night the police came, the night everything changed. He thought about it too, every single day. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't called," she continued. Enrique shivered at the thought, but he didn't let himself go too far down that road. "But I did," he said simply. And maybe that was the only thing that really mattered. The weight of Marina's words settled between them, heavier than the night air. Enrique clenched his hands into fists, his nails pressing into his palms, grounding himself in the present. He didn't want to think about what could have happened if he hadn't called. That possibility was too dark, too unbearable. The thought of Marina still trapped in that house, of Marcelo still towering over them, dictating every breath they took, it made his stomach turn. He forced himself to take a slow breath, releasing the tension in his fingers. "But I did," he repeated, firmer this time, "and we're here now." Marina nodded, but she still looked distant, as if part of her was stuck somewhere she couldn't escape. She kicked the ground again, making the swing creak softly, the sound blending with the rustling leaves. "I keep wondering if I could have stopped it sooner," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I had told Mom, if I had fought back, if I had—" She trailed off, shaking her head, as if the words themselves were too much to say. Enrique's chest tightened. He hated that she was blaming herself. He hated that Marcelo had left behind more than just bruises. He had left doubt, guilt, the kind that clung to them like a shadow. "You didn't do anything wrong," Enrique said, his voice sharper than he intended. Marina's eyes snapped to his, startled. "You shouldn't have had to stop it," he continued. "It wasn't your job, it wasn't your fault." She stared at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she believed him. Enrique held her gaze, willing her to understand. It made him angry, not at her, but at the fact that Marcelo had made her feel this way, that he had made them both feel like they should have done more, when the truth was they had already done more than anyone should have to. Marina exhaled slowly, looking away, her fingers tightening around the metal chains of the swing. "I know," she murmured. "I just wish I felt like it wasn't my fault." Enrique knew that feeling too. The way logic told you one thing, but your heart refused to believe it. Healing wasn't as simple as knowing the truth. It was about learning how to feel it, and that, he realized, was going to take time. The wind picked up slightly, making the old swing chains rattle against the metal frame. Enrique let his hands fall to his sides, feeling the roughness of the rusted swing beneath his fingers. He wished there was a way to take Marina's guilt away, to convince her that none of this was her fault. But words weren't always enough, and pain didn't just disappear because someone told you it should. He knew that firsthand. He had spent so many nights wondering if there was something else he could have done, if he should have spoken up sooner, if he had failed Marina by not acting earlier. But guilt was a trap, one that kept them both tied to a past they were trying to escape. "You don't have to feel okay yet," Enrique finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "But you don't have to carry all of it alone either." Marina didn't respond right away. She just stared ahead, her expression unreadable, but Enrique could see the way her shoulders relaxed just a little. Maybe she hadn't realized it before, that she wasn't the only one trying to figure out how to move forward, that they were both stuck in the same place, looking for the same way out. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the cold metal chains. "I know," she whispered. "I just don't know how to stop feeling this way." Enrique nodded, because he didn't know either. He had thought that once Marcelo was gone, once they were safe, everything would feel different. But fear didn't just disappear, and neither did the memories. They followed you, stuck to you, whispered to you in the quiet moments when you weren't expecting them. Maybe that was what healing really was, learning how to live with the past without letting it define you. He wasn't sure how long it would take, or if they would ever completely feel normal again, but at least they weren't figuring it out alone. Marina let out a slow breath, tilting her head back to look at the sky again. The stars were still faint, barely visible, but they were there. "Do you think Mum's scared too?" she asked suddenly. Enrique thought about it for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," he admitted. "I think she's just trying to hide it." Marina let out a small, humorless laugh. "That sounds like her." Enrique smiled faintly because it was true. Raquel was strong, but even strong people could be afraid. Maybe they all were, but fear wasn't what defined them. Not anymore. The night stretched on around them, quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Enrique didn't want to go back inside just yet, and judging by the way Marina kept staring at the sky, neither did she. There was something comforting about being out here, away from the weight of walls and closed doors, away from the memories that still clung to the apartment. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they weren't trapped. The world felt bigger out here, more open, like there was space to breathe. Enrique wondered if Marina felt that too. Eventually, Marina shifted, hugging her knees to her chest. "I keep thinking about what's next," she admitted. "Like, what are we even supposed to do now?" Enrique frowned slightly, considering her words. They had spent so long surviving, reacting, running. Now that the worst was over, it was like they didn't know how to just exist. What did normal even look like after everything? He glanced at his sister, seeing the uncertainty in her expression, the way she kept fidgeting like she wasn't sure where she belonged anymore. Maybe none of them did. "I guess we just keep going," Enrique said finally. "One day at a time." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the only one he had. Marina sighed, resting her chin on her knees. "I don't even know what that looks like." Enrique didn't either, but he didn't say that out loud. Instead, he nudged her foot lightly with his own. "Maybe we figure it out together." For the first time all night, Marina smiled, not big, not full of joy, but real. "Yeah," she murmured, "maybe we do." A car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly illuminating the park before disappearing down the street. The moment stretched between them, quiet but not uncomfortable. Enrique let out a slow breath, feeling the weight in his chest ease just a little. Maybe nothing had changed tonight. Maybe they were still just two kids trying to make sense of things that didn't make sense. But at least for now, they weren't doing it alone. And sometimes that was enough.